It's time for my favorite Pokemon Pocket video of the week. I've combed through thousands of deck lists so you don't have to, and today we're going to highlight the most interesting deck lists that had successful results in our community tournaments in the last week. Let's go ahead and get into it, shall we? Last week, I posted a deck highlight featuring Banette, saying that it felt incredibly strong to me, and this weekend we had not one but two different variations featuring this potent ghost Pokemon, finished 6 and 2 in one of the largest tournaments. Banette's effect is incredibly strong. If you haven't played with or against it, it locks your opponent out of attaching energy to their active Pokemon on the following turn. This is an ability that's not explicitly tied to the Pokemon that you're hitting, meaning that your opponent can't evolve out of it. And if Banette deals a finishing blow with its attack, the no energy to the active applies to the follow-up Pokemon as well. This also restricts other effects that add energy from the energy zone, such as Gueritina's Pokemon ability or Misty flipping heads. The only real way in the existing metagame to get energy onto the active once Banette has done its thing is a copy of Lunala's Pokemon ability or something like Dawn that's moving it from somewhere else already on your board. Banette really feels like a card that's well positioned in part due to the fact that a lot of people right now are skimping on their copies of X Speed as well as Leaf, meaning that if you're able to catch something without enough energy to attack on it and without enough energy to retreat in the active spot, you lock it in, hitting it for 30 damage every single turn, while your opponent is stuck just sitting there building up something else on the bench and hoping that it's good enough after the fact. This is where the secondary attacker in these decks comes in, Tapule. A lot of the time your opponent's going to be building up something big since they can't do anything with their lead with Banette, and then Tapule gets to go, okay, you put a bunch of energy on something, I'm going to hit it really hard for just one Psychic. Both these deck lists also feature different finishing EX Pokemon. In the case of one of them, we have Mew EX as well as Arceus EX. In the case of the other, we have Mewtwo, who can charge up to 4 quite easily, while Banette holds something hostage. I will say, this archetype, from my own experience playing it, feels incredibly difficult to play both with and against. And I think as it gets optimized and people figure out how to play against it, there'll be some interesting tension as these weird play patterns finally get figured out. I would love to hear in the comments down below if you had a chance to play with Banette personally and what you think of it. Is it too tricky to have a long-standing impact as people learn to play around it, or is it really pretty powerful? Another Psychic variation that put up a pair of successful runs this weekend was Togekiss. These deck lists went 8-3 and 9-3 respectively in the tournaments that they were played in. The core is very similar between these two. We see all single knockout point Pokemon, forcing your opponent to get 3 clears in order to beat you, as well as 2 copies of Rare Candy and Cynthia, adding consistency and speed, as well as some added power so you can hit harder faster or do bigger swings once you're revved up. It's not surprising to me to see Togekiss punch through a little bit this week after the play rate of Solgaleo went down a significant amount since it had a pretty poor performance during our first 2 weeks. In particular, Togekiss is weak to metal, so it's a little bit susceptible to being attacked by one of our newest EXs. That being said, this card, especially in tandem with the support that we see in terms of healing in one of these deck lists with 2 copies of Lily, can sustain for a good long while, letting you get revved up to 120 points of damage ASAP, clearing out lots of things on the opponent's side of the board and only risking 1 knockout point when your opponent eventually clears you out. My personal favorite Psychic deck in this week's roundup, though, is definitely this Mimikyu Aceola variation that felt really clean in the games that I've played with it so far. This deck list gives me big vibes back to the fighting Farfetch'd deck that I had played during the Mythical Island expansion. You're all pretty efficient 1 knockout point Pokemon with Tapule, Farfetch'd, and Oricorio, in addition to Mimikyu as the deck's namesake. It feels really powerful to be able to set up big swing turns where Mimikyu deals 60 and then Aceola tacks on additional 40 on these cards that otherwise only offer up 1 knockout point and typically attack for very efficient amounts of energy. Tapule in particular is a card that feels like it's going to be a metagame staple moving forward, as long as Gueritinas and Darkrai's are amping up to 3 and even 4 energy, attacking for 60 or even 80 in a single go for just 1 energy as hyper efficient, and you mix in Oricorio as a Mars Shadow style effect that also gives you a solid burst after your opponent knocks out one of your Pokemon, and it feels like a pretty potent combination to be reckoned with. If you want to see this deck in action, make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss the highlight of it tomorrow morning. Another one of our new supporters from the latest expansion, Lana, gets on the scoreboard this week with a 5-2 finish in the tournament that it was played in. Her effect is incredibly powerful if you can meet its requirement, a combination Sabrina Cyrus where you get to choose which card is coming up with no restrictions on HP, gives you a lot of control over the course of the game. That being said, you do have to have Araquand in play, who at face value is pretty reasonable, I think, into a lot of the threats we have in our metagame, dealing 120 damage for just 3 energy all of the time against things like Gueritina and Darkrai is pretty reasonable, especially when you're ramping it up ahead of curve with Manaphy. This deck list at its core, past these two unique elements, resembles a lot of the Manaphy decks that we've seen in the past, things like Misty and Irida, as well as Pokemon tools like Rocky Helmet to add a little bit of support, and then a singleton copy of Palkia as a potent finisher after your Araquand's attacks are all used up. Next up, we have Crab Amenable, backed up by Greninja, making an 8-2 run in one of our tournaments. A really excellent deck building decision I like in this list is leaning into the sustainability of the Crab. We see a copy of Giant Cape as well as 2 copies of Irida to help it live on the battlefield as long as possible. And because the energy costs of the attacks of all the Pokemon inside of this deck are so low, it's not playing any copies of Misty, giving plenty of room for utility like Leaf and Cyrus, in addition to the 9 copies of Pokemon cards that you are leveraging here. Dragonite Oricorio actually put up a number of strong finishes in this past week, the best of which was 9-2. One of the biggest problems Dragonite as an archetype has always had is its consistency and getting everything together quickly enough, and Oricorio gives you this brick wall for stalling into a lot of the common EX matchups that you're going to play in the metagame. The inclusion of Gueritina here also solves another issue that Dragonite can have, which is what is your game plan when Dragonite can't carry a game all on its own. It's pretty common that your Dragonite will get a knockout or 2, but then because you put so much energy onto the stage 2 Pokemon, you don't have another threat built up. Well, Giratina brings its own psychic energy along for the ride, meaning you can build it up along with Dragonite simultaneously, so in the games where your big dragon can't win the game all on its own, Giratina is ready to jump in and clean up for the last knockout point or 2. Because this deck list has water energy, it also gets to play Irida as opposed to the more limited Lily, so that way your sustain can be helping your Oricorios and even Giratina stay alive in a pinch in case Dragonite is nowhere to be found. Lunala Gueritina had a 5-2 finish in the tournament that it was played in, and honestly, this is a card that I wouldn't be surprised if we start to see a little bit more of it as the meta game develops. It feels incredibly powerful to be able to pivot your EXs in and out of that lead position and never miss a beat in what you're attacking with, since Lunala allows you to move the energy to whatever your new attacker is. The 2 copies of Leaf in this deck list are instrumental in making this possible, so that way you can pull things like the Namesake or Giratina out while keeping all the energies on them to move to the next thing. This particular deck list is also playing a singleton copy of Baby Giratina, who provides its own free retreat cost with its Pokemon ability, and notably does 70 points of damage in a single hit, allowing you to clear out opposing copies of Oricorio without missing a beat before you pivot back to a powerful EX attacker to beat up whatever was hiding behind that demonic yellow chicken. In last week's New Deck Roundup, we talked about Incineroar as well as Infernape featuring Turtonator as a secondary attacker, not only to pump out pressure early alongside its support card, but also giving these EX-driven decks a way to clear through opposing copies of Oricorio. In enter a Charizard variation, essentially trying to do the same thing, and I wouldn't be surprised if all 3 of these are very reasonable things to have. Turtonator in general feels like a card that's very well positioned if you hit the supporter card early, even against non-Oricorio things. Starting to attack for 90 damage when you're attaching your first energy when going first gives you an immense amount of pressure, even letting you clear out things like Giratina and Darkrai in 2 shots. That being said, there's a little bit of a risk associated with this. It is a 4 retreat cost Pokemon, meaning in the games where you don't have your supporter, it's going to be locked into giving up a point to start, but that's not all downside in these decks with these bigger EXs, because it gives you time to assemble them in the backline. A blast from Pokemon Pocket's distant past, Mewtwo EX Gardevoir puts up a 7-3 finish while leveraging a number of new tools. We see Tapule as an additional attacker here, letting you pressure things like Darkrai and Gueritina on your opponent's bench. And then obviously Rare Candy is the biggest pickup for this archetype. Past obviously letting you get to Gardevoir faster, it really makes your curves a lot more impressive. Having first evolution with Rare Candy means that you can start hitting with Mewtwo for 50 on the second turn and then start blasting for 150 on the follow-up turn after that. In addition to Candy, we're also gaining a tool like Iono in order to find all of your pieces that much more consistently inside of this previous metagame powerhouse. A mono Beedrill deck featuring the entire evolution line, Rare Candy, and both EX and Baby Beedrill went 7-3 in one of our community tournaments. I like the core idea of this deck list a lot. You're going to get to one of your stage 2s hyper consistently between your communications and having 4 copies of them in your deck. The flexibility of playing Baby Beedrill in addition to EX Beedrill also means that your deck has a very clean answer to opposing copies of Oricorio, and because everything in here is grass, you get to play Leaf Cape as well as Erica to give you an incredible amount of sustain to keep your things alive for as long as possible once you get set up. One thing that feels like it could be especially cheeky to try in this deck is perhaps a copy of the Celestial Town Elder could be slick to allow you to pick back up that Weedle and build it back up to a different Beedrill after it gets knocked out, letting you have 3 Bees in a single game. While Carnivine Crobat has undoubtedly been the more popular Arceus build, there were a number of successful runs featuring Kangaskhan and Ilima this past weekend as well, such as the one that's currently up on your screen. The primary upside to this build is twofold. The first is that you get to play Dark Energy, meaning that your Crobat, when you evolve into it quickly, can start attacking for 80 damage all on its own without needing another piece like Carnivine to be thrown into the mix. The second is that Ilima not only picks your Kangaskhan up, allowing you to retreat it for free once it has some damage on it, but it helps mitigate your awkward Arceus starts, which often slow down these decks to an insane degree. Thanks to Crobat in the backline, your opponent will feel pressured to try and get through your Arceus, giving you a window to pick it up with Ilima and hit with your other single 1 knockout point Pokemon before eventually finishing on your EX Legendary. Finally, we had one of my favorite variations of Solgaleo put up an 8-2 finish in one of our tournaments featuring Snorlax and Berry. One of the big downsides that Snorlax has as a card is that its hefty retreat cost keeps it locked into your active spot until your opponent dictates they're going to knock it out. In enter Solgaleo's Pokemon ability, which lets you jump it up to the front as soon as you're ready to go, giving you the upside of Snorlax with powerful early hits thanks to Berry's support, while Solgaleo mitigates the downside that it primarily has. If you enjoyed this week's new decks roundup, be sure to smash the like button on today's video. I'd also love to hear in the comments down below which of these deck lists you're looking forward to trying out the most. If you happen to be new here and you enjoy deck list roundups like this one, be sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of them or any of the highlights of the best decks from here in my own experience coming up here soon. As always, I appreciate everybody that made it all the way through to the end of the video, and I hope your next pack is an excellent one.
The decks in this video may be worse than their statistically insignificant sample sizes make them appear. There is no easy button for getting to Masters in Pokemon Pocket, and if you are looking for that in this YouTube video or any other, you will likely be sorely disappointed.